2015 had already been a year of fear for France, but nothing could have prepared the country for what was coming on November 13th. While security was high and warnings were circulating, 9 attackers were already in position, ready to strike the very heart of Parisian life. From the first explosion at the gates of the Stade de France to the terrifying siege inside the Bataclan, this is the story of a night where ordinary citizens became targets in a calculated campaign of terror that the world will never forget. Before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into how it all started. Paris didn't walk into that night unprepared. The warning signs had been building for months. Earlier in 2015, attacks had already shaken the country, leaving 17 people dead in January and putting France on high alert. Security was tightened, patrols increased, and the sense of unease never really went away. Throughout the year, smaller incidents kept happening. A stabbing targeting soldiers in Nice, an attempted explosion at a factory, even an attack on a passenger train. Each one added pressure, like something was slowly building beneath the surface. There were also concerns beyond France. Just days before November 13th, a Russian airliner was bombed and attacks struck Beirut. The pattern was becoming harder to ignore. Warnings had reportedly been shared months earlier about a possible threat to France. But in a system dealing with constant alerts, not every warning stood out. Some were treated as routine. At the same time, major global events were approaching in Paris, and security measures were already being stepped up. On the outside, everything looked controlled. But underneath that calm, something far more organized was already in motion. And within hours, those early warnings became a reality that no one could stop. At 9:16 p.m., the first sign that something was wrong came from just outside the Stade de France. Inside, thousands of fans were watching an international football match between France and Germany. Even the French president was in the stadium that night. It felt like a normal evening. But just outside one of the gates, a man wearing an explosive vest was stopped during a routine security check. Within seconds, he stepped back and detonated it. The blast killed him and a bystander nearby. Only 3 minutes later, at 9:19 p.m., a second explosion went off near another entrance. Then, at 9:53 p.m., a third attacker detonated his vest near a nearby fast food outlet. All 3 attackers were wearing similar explosive devices, moving with the same intent. Inside the stadium, many people heard the sounds but didn't understand what they were. The match continued. Players kept playing. The crowd stayed seated, unaware of what was unfolding outside. The president was quietly moved to safety during the game without causing panic. What could have turned into a much larger disaster was stopped at the gates, but this was only the beginning. Just minutes after the first shootings, the attackers appeared again. At around 9:32 p.m., they reached another busy street, this time near Café Bon Bière and the restaurant La Casa Nostra. People were gathered outside, enjoying the night, unaware of what had already happened nearby. Without warning, the gunmen stepped out and opened fire once again. In seconds, 5 people were killed and 8 others were seriously injured. The attack was quick, controlled, and just as sudden as the first, but it didn't stop there. By 9:36 p.m., the same attackers reached another location, La Belle Équipe, a popular spot filled with people sitting on the outdoor terrace. This time, the attack lasted longer. Witnesses described it continuing for several minutes before the attackers drove away. The damage was far worse. 21 people were killed at this single location, with several others left in critical condition. The pattern was now clear. The attackers were moving through the city, choosing crowded places, striking quickly, and disappearing before anyone could react. Across these locations, ordinary moments were being turned into scenes of fear in a matter of seconds. And just when it seemed like the attacks couldn't get any worse, the deadliest chapter of the night was about to begin. At around 9:40 p.m., the focus shifted to a packed concert hall on Boulevard Voltaire. Inside the Bataclan Theatre, nearly 1,500 people were gathered watching a live performance. It was loud, energetic, and felt completely normal. Outside, 3 attackers had been waiting. Then suddenly, they moved in. They opened fire at the entrance before forcing their way inside. At first, many people thought the sounds were part of the show, but within seconds, the reality became clear. Panic spread quickly. People tried to escape, duck, or hide wherever they could. The attackers moved through the crowd, continuing their assault inside the hall. The space that once held music was now filled with confusion and fear. Within a short time, the situation escalated further as people were held inside. What started as an attack had now turned into a hostage situation. By the time it slowed, the scale of what had happened inside was devastating. 90 people lost their lives at the Bataclan alone, making it the deadliest location of the night. This was no longer just a series of attacks. It had become something much bigger, and as the situation inside the Bataclan continued to unfold, and time itself seemed to slow down for everyone watching. As the situation inside the Bataclan continued, the scene turned into a long and tense standoff. Around 10 p.m, hostages were being held inside the theatre. People who had come for a concert were now trapped, waiting without knowing what would happen next. Police units began arriving within minutes. The first officers entered with limited equipment, facing a situation far bigger than expected. As more forces surrounded the building, the focus shifted to containing the threat and saving those still inside. Inside, the attackers held groups of people and denouement and made demands. Time stretched. Every minute felt longer than the last. Outside, the streets were locked down, and emergency teams prepared for what could come next. By 11:30 p.m, specialised units had moved in and began organising a response. The tension built slowly, with brief contact attempts made while the situation remained unstable. Then, at 0:20 a.m, the decision was made. Police moved in. Within minutes, the standoff came to an end. By 0:58 a.m, the siege was over. Those inside were finally brought out, but the impact of what had happened would not fade quickly. And as the night came to a close, the full scale of what Paris had just faced was only beginning to be understood. By the time the attacks had ended, the reality of that night began to settle in. What had unfolded across different parts of the city was not just a series of incidents. It was one of the most devastating nights in modern French history. In total, 130 people were killed and 416 were injured, with nearly 100 of those in critical condition. The scale was overwhelming. Hospitals across Paris were pushed to respond quickly as victims were brought in from multiple locations at once. The losses were spread across the city. The Bataclan alone accounted for 90 deaths, making it the hardest hit location. Restaurants and cafes saw heavy losses as well, with 21 people killed at La Belle Équipe and others across nearby streets. Even the area around the stadium was not untouched. People from different countries were among the victims, all showing just how global the impact was. What started as a normal evening had turned into something that affected lives far beyond Paris. For many, the physical injuries were only part of the story. The emotional impact stayed long after that night ended. This was not just about numbers. Each number was a person, a story, a life that had been part of that evening. And while Paris tried to come to terms with the loss, the search for answers had already begun. As the city tried to process what had happened, attention quickly turned to who was behind it. It became clear that this was not the work of a single group acting alone. 3 coordinated teams carried out 6 separate attacks across Paris. In total, 7 attackers died during the night, either during the attacks or as the situation came to an end. But the operation didn't stop there. The authorities began searching for others connected to the plan. The attacks were linked to a larger network based outside France. Communication between attackers was being handled in real time from another country, showing a level of planning that went beyond the city itself. Within days, key figures connected to the attacks were identified. On November 18th, the suspected lead planner was killed during a police raid in Saint-Denis, along with others involved. The response was immediate and wide-reaching. A state of emergency was declared across France, giving authorities expanded powers to act quickly. Raids were carried out across multiple locations, and security measures were tightened nationwide. Soon after, France launched one of its largest military responses as part of ongoing operations overseas. What happened that night didn't just end in Paris. It changed how threats were seen and how countries prepared for what could come next. And as the world reacted, Paris was left to remember a night it would never forget. Paris didn't just lose lives that night, it lost a sense of normal. In the days that followed, people opened their doors to strangers using hashtag Portes Ouvertes, and thousands gathered in silence, turning grief into unity. The city kept moving, but it was never quite the same again. The first attacker was stopped by a routine security check at the stadium. Do you think the stadium would have been a much larger tragedy if not for that one guard's vigilance? For those who remember that night, how do you think it permanently changed the way we view safety in public spaces? In 2022, the only surviving attacker, Salah Abdeslam, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the harshest penalty in French law. If you enjoyed this historical breakdown, please like the video and subscribe to help us continue documenting these stories. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.